You've heard the story before. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. The British started raising taxes. Tea was thrown into a harbor. Paul Revere did his famous midnight ride. And George Washington founded the greatest democracy the world has ever seen, based on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the idea that all men are created equal. Or maybe you've heard an alternative story. Rapacious settlers stole the land from the natives, brought over kidnapped slaves from Africa, and institutionalized a system of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. But neither of these narratives satisfactorily explain why we are here and where we come from. Civilizations craft historical narratives to make their existence seem like a foregone conclusion. And it should be obvious to any with a discerning eye which narrative is dominant. Tonight, on the inaugural episode of the Manifest Destiny podcast, we explore the political, historical, religious, and racial origins of America and of Americans, and what they mean for us today. Manifest Destiny means obvious certainty. But what is so obvious and so certain about us as a people? We will endeavor to unlock this and more. Because you cannot know where you're going unless you know where you've been. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of the Manifest Destiny podcast. My name is Ace Niederhoff LaFleur, and I am joined by my co-hosts Frank Whiteman and Arthur Morgan.
Hi, I'm Francis Whiteman. I go by Frank.
Arthur Morgan here.
Before we get in, just some quick introduction, housekeeping items. This is a new project that we've been kicking around for a while, and figured it was finally time to execute and get it done. These are topics that we're pretty passionate about, and we have a lot to say, and we hope maybe someone can learn a thing or two from here. The point of this show is to tell facets of history, primarily American history, about where we come from and where we're going, and how that may contrast with the narratives of popular culture, of what people might learn in school, and what we're generally thought to think of ourselves as a people. We figured the best place to start would be at the beginning. Where does America come from? Who are Americans? Why do we exist? How did we arrive on this continent? And what made us an independent nation? And of course, was it worth it? I think with that, we can go ahead and get started, gentlemen. I'll turn this over to Frank. Frank, what do you know about the beginnings of America?
When I think about the American Revolution, I think, one of the early pieces of mythos that I heard, one of the first things I remember really, was hearing about George Washington, the cherry tree, etc. And I don't know, I find it kind of telling that one of the first things that I knew about the American Revolution is a story. I remember my mom told me, I was like 5 or something, and yeah, all right, he comes, he chops down the cherry tree, he says, I cannot tell a lie, blah, 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 but the reality is that whether or not that actually happened is kind of up for debate, right? And I think that's pretty symbolic of a lot about the American Revolution, in the sense that it's a factoid which may not have actually happened in the first place, right? I think it's kind of telling. But that's, and you can talk about, we fought this revolution, it's based on ideals, people were rebelling against taxes, people wanted economic freedom, people wanted the right to bear arms, people wanted freedom to worship, people wanted freedom of speech, and everybody fought for these Enlightenment ideals, which were, it was a revolution of ideas, really, is classically what one is taught, even in conservative circles today.
I think it's interesting that I asked you, what do you know about the beginning of America? And you start with the Revolution.
Right. Well, a bunch of people were obviously here before then, but...
There were people here. The first ancestors of Americans had been here for over 150 years by the time of Lexington and Concord, but we'll get into that. Arthur, how about you?
Oh, what I think the origins of America are, just everything they've taught us. It's about transgenders coming across the border. It's about, illegal immigration, all that. No, just kidding. It's a great topic. It's quite a large one. People will point to the American Revolution as kind of the birth of America. That's, kind of I would say not necessarily the truth. I mean, there's definitely a lot that happened during that time period, but what it means to be an American maybe kind of ties to where does America come from, and truly America and its history, its ideals, and specifically its people are very different from the way that we've been taught what we think an American is, right? How, today an American is just anyone that comes here, gets a passport, it's all about, freedom of speech and all these like freedoms and all that, where there's, I guess, a bit of truth to it.
I'm hearing the word freedom.
Exactly, right. Like it's this, philosophy, this, we, stuck it to the Brits and like all this happened, but there's really so much about America that, like, in its origins, its thoughts, right, and even philosophically on how it started and where it stems from its people and where they came from originally. What, I feel like it's a shortfall there in our education system and our knowledge. And
you guys kind of touched on what's really going on here. If you were to ask most people, what do you think about the founding of America, you'll probably hear something about the first Thanksgiving at Plymouth Rock.
Right.
You'll hear something about the Boston Tea Party and Paul Revere's Midnight Ride and the Declaration of Independence, and you will especially hear all men are created equal. I know. There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot to shrug about that. But there's more to it. People are more than ideas. Nations are not ideas. Nations are people.
with a long history and a story.
With a long history and a story, but more to it. A nation is not its constitution. A nation is not freedom of speech. It's not freedom of religion. Nor is it the right to bear arms. Nor is it private property and free market capitalism. A nation is also not equality nor social progress. A nation is people. Who are people? They are people that share common kinship. They speak a common language. They have a common history. A common religion. Common cultural attitudes, norms of etiquette and social grace, manners, cultural practices, food and dress, hobby, that kind of thing. All of the trappings that you would associate with a nation. And here's a mental exercise you can do. If I were to ask you to picture a Mexican in your mind, there's probably a mental image you would draw
Immediately, right?
Probably
yeah.
someone who's kind of brown.
Right.
Maybe is wearing a sombrero and a poncho.
Spanish.
Speaks
right.
Spanish. Probably Catholic. Maybe is eating a taco. These are stereotypical observations, but they're there because we know there's a certain culture and people associated with Mexico. You could apply that to Russians. You could apply that to Chinese, Germans, Japanese. But when you apply it to Americans, I think people get squeamish. They'll say, well, an American is someone who salutes the flag, respects our customs, whatever those are. An American is someone who pays taxes. I've heard that one before.
Goes to a baseball game, right? Like, does things like that.
Exactly. But, if we talk about the founding of America and the American Revolution, and you try to get into the mindset of the people in those days, they did not think about it in that way. I don't think Thomas Jefferson or George Washington would have thought an American is somebody who, likes our music or likes apple pie. He would have been very aware of what an American was, and the people who were alive at the time, both here and in Britain, were also aware of what an American was. There's a lot of discussion back and forth about what it meant to be that, and it was defined fairly explicitly by a lot of early Americans. So I think with that, I can kick off. Where do Americans come from? We can give the long-winded answer, go down the HBD route, that the first proto-ancestor of an American was an early offshoot of a Neanderthal hominid living in last glacial maximum Europe about 70,000 years ago. And as the ice sheets retreated, different genetic mutations took place to select for certain kinds of time preferences, maybe hair and skin color, levels of individuality and communal kinship. And that's all true. I'm not going to deny that. There's definitely evidence to back that up. But I don't think any nation, if you were to ask them, where do your people come from, are going to go back to an early hominid. But
maybe
it plays a role. I mean, hey, the first American was a proto-simian mammal back when the continents were in different locations where they are now. No, I'm kidding. But we can draw the history of where Americans come from much further back than 1776 and even further back than 1607 at the founding of Jamestown. To keep this brief, I'm about to gloss over about 1,500 years of history, but I think it's a good place to start, would be the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. Long story short, you had Saxons, primarily a tribe in Germany, also joined by a group called the Angles, who were a tribe in Denmark, as well as the Jutes, also from Denmark, and some other more marginal Germanic groups.
And where were they located?
This would have been what is today the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, kind of along the North Sea area.
Right.
This, at the time that this happened, this would have been the 4th century, the 300s. The Roman Empire had been fighting a series of wars along the Rhine River area, which is sort of the frontier that separated the Saxon world from the Roman world. And they had been fighting a number of wars there for a long time to try to subdue the Saxons. And they ultimately failed in doing that. As a side note, the Saxon tribes would not actually be subdued until many centuries later, when Charlemagne converted them to Christianity.
Right, in 800.
But that's skipping ahead a bit. So anyways, in the late Roman Empire, 4th century 300s, the Romans did control southern Britain, what is today England and Wales. But by then, their control had been tenuous. They were suffering revolts from the local Celtic peoples and started inviting over Saxon mercenaries to help keep the peace. But very quickly, a group of brothers, probably would have been of the Angles or the Jutes rather than Saxons, but still lumped into that broader Germanic family, realized there's an opportunity. They smelled the blood in the water, the Romans were weak, and they saw their chance. These brothers, Misters Hengist and Horsa from Denmark, got in their longboats, what I believe they would have been called. You know the type of stereotypical Viking boat. Actually. But they smelled the blood in the water with the Romans and invaded England and pretty swiftly put them to the sword. The Romans left, they packed up and fled, and then the native Celtic people called the Britons, who, I guess for lack of a better description, the ancestors of modern-day Welsh, were put to the sword pretty heartily. Modern historians will try to say that the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England didn't necessarily happen. It was just a cultural replacement. They didn't send that many people, but I don't think it really pans out that way. There's a YouTuber by the name of Survive the Jive who covers this in great detail. I'd recommend checking his stuff out if you want an overview of the Anglo-Saxon migrations. The point is, though, that by the 400s, the 5th centuries, these Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes, had well and truly conquered England and were beginning to push into Wales and make incursions into Scotland. This forms the foundation of English culture. The name England comes from Anglia, the Angles. A lot of the place names in England, also transplanted in America, come from the Saxons. Sussex, South Saxon; Wessex, West Saxon; Essex, East Saxon. Other names: East Anglia in England, East Anglia, England, yeah, makes sense.
From Angle. Right.
Exactly. You had some other territories they set up as well. A famous one is Northumbria, which means north of the Humber River. They were Angle Kingdom in kind of northern England, but they had made excursions into Scotland as well and had a massive impact on the development of Scotland. To kind of breeze past this, over the course of the next couple hundred years, the Anglo-Saxon various tribes and kingdoms that were in England consolidated. And they stopped being Saxons and Angles and Jutes and became English people, united by King Alfred the Great. To a lesser extent, a similar process happened in the lowlands of Scotland. That's why they speak English and not
Gaelic.
Not Gaelic. But broad strokes, we have the foundations of what would be recognizably England and Scotland. Fast forward a bit, 1066, the Norman invasion. This brings England into the continental fold by its conquest of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, from what is modern-day France. The Normans, an interesting people in and of themselves. They had lived in France. They spoke a variant of the French language, but be hard-pressed to really call them French per se. Norman means Northman. These people were descended from Vikings. Just 2 generations before William the Conqueror, Normandy was ruled by a man named Rollo, who was himself a Viking from Norway. So I guess what I'm getting at is the formation of the nations that would become England and to a lesser extent Scotland. You had a lot of Germanic people moving in. Saxons, Vikings, Angles and Jutes. Later there would be Frisians, who are tribal people from the northern Netherlands. You had some migrations of Franks who were pissed off at Charlemagne, just some political refugees. But the point is that England is formed as very much a Germanic nation and is fully part of the Germanic world. Linguistic influences from the Normans notwithstanding. To understand Americans, you need to understand where Americans come from. And at the time of the settlement of the colonies, and especially in the American Revolution, people would have been aware of the history that I just described. To give a strong example of what I'm talking about, at the time of independence, or actually this would have been a little bit later, when the founding fathers were going about creating a new government, they have to create symbols for that government. One of those is a seal. You are familiar with the Great Seal of the United States. It is an eagle with a red, white, and blue shield on it. That was not the only design they considered, and the design proposed by Thomas Jefferson was one of Hengist and Horsa, because he believed that they were the progenitors of Americans. And this is, back to my point, something that would have been widely known by the people living in the colonies of where they really came from. They knew they came from England, but they also knew where English people came from and what that meant for them. So let's fast forward a little bit more. Let's go to the 14th century. This is the 1300s. How did people end up in America? What was going on? You had a lot of crazy things in Europe at the time between the Black Death and the Ottoman invasions, and these were spurring massive demographic changes throughout Europe. But they were
the 100 Years' War as well.
100 Years' War. Basically a time of crisis. They call this a crisis of the late Middle Ages. Lots of unpleasant things were happening, but it caused a very significant demographic shift in Europe. And it was particularly noted in England, northern France, Germany, and the Low Countries, so Belgium and the Netherlands. But you had an issue where there were massive amounts of casualties from various wars, disease, the mortality rate was high. It was primarily targeting the lower classes, the peasant stock of these various countries. And what that ended up doing is creating a situation where the upper classes began to outbreed the lower class and started to demographically replace them. You had downwardly mobile second sons of nobility in England being reduced to the status of commoners and then having to compete against the serfs and the peasants. But because they are still of noble stock, they're generally probably going to be higher IQ, maybe more diligent, harder working. They're going to be more educated, so they're able to start outcompeting the peasants and outbreeding them, and start having fairly large families. Once Europe gets through these crises, you start to see an explosion in population. And like I said, one of the places it was concentrated was England. And this is particularly important because it was an explosion of the population of generally capable people. People that were willing to take risks. You know, these people aren't nobles anymore, they're now commoners. They're going to be more likely to engage in merchant activity, in trade. They're going to become craftsmen and artisans, independent, self-starting people. People that are willing to take risks, put their own capital on the line, and do what they need to do to be successful and provide for their families. And when you repeat that for several centuries, over many generations, it kind of creates an effect of making a culture of entrepreneurial people who have a strong sense of property rights. It's the only way they can compete with the aristocracy is if their own freeholding properties, whatever farm or workshop that they own, they know they can have that enforced in a court of law. And you're going to have a strong sense of individuality. These people are self-starters. That means they're going to be less likely to give fealty to a noble lord or a priest or a bishop. And you can kind of starting to see
and you had
where American attitudes are coming from here.
And you had mentioned one thing that you said that was two things actually. First, double backing to real quick on like the idea of the Saxons and the Angles, moving, migrating, if you will, conquering England, right, and having that mentality, that thought, that I don't know how to explain it, but
the yearning to move west.
Exactly, right? Like, and I mean, hence like the podcast name, but that idea was something that every American, and by what I mean American is not the American that we've been taught in school, where it's just something.
It is not a basketball American,
exactly,
nor is it a pop star American.
Exactly, right. It's not that kind of American that just pounds like, oh, freedom of speech. Like no, it goes deep, right, and it goes to exactly what you had said, and that thought process was whether they knew it or not, which they definitely did, obviously. I think that was a big driver of kind of progressing, right? But like that's an important
yes. So
I think it's also important to highlight here that the Hengist and Horsa myth is sort of a proto form of manifest destiny, right?
Myth? I'm sorry?
Oh, I see. No, but they one of the things they did when they arrived was they sent home and they said, hey, these Britons are worthless, and by the way, the land is really good for growing stuff. And so they invited a bunch of their Saxon
they brought their
Saxon
families
brethren.
with
They
them.
brought their families
exactly.
with them, and they sent for more from home, which is, if you look at where we're going with this, it's kind of ties in there. But go ahead.
Yeah.
The story of hardy Germanic people hearing the beckon to sail westwards to a new land and just totally run roughshod over the barbarians that live there, and set up a new country that is based on property rights. This stuff is in our blood.
Oh yeah.
This does not just come from Lexington and Concord.
Of course not.
This comes from the rocky shores of Denmark and northern Germany, and carries through from England to Ireland to Virginia to California and beyond. But getting back to it, you can kind of see with the way I was describing these demographic changes in England, you're having the development of a population that is going to be predisposed to be self-starting commoners who may not be of noble birth anymore, but they're going to own property.
And they've got the noble genes.
They're going to have that diligent attitude, risk-taking, self-starting, being highly defensive of their property rights, their farm or their workshop, because that is their livelihood. And going to be less inclined to take shit from civil authority in a funny hat, whether it be a king or a bishop. But that only tells part of the story, because they're still in England. How do we get to America, then, at this point? Everyone knows the story that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I think there's a little bit more to it than that. People are aware that in the 11th century, so in the 1000s or so, the Vikings, led by Leif Erikson, Eric the Red.
Is he Iceland? Is that right, or is that?
He had found Iceland, but they kept pushing into Greenland and had also landed in Newfoundland, what is today Canada. They never really established.
God, I hate that country. I just gotta say that.
We will touch on our wayward Anglo brothers to the north and where
they're full of shit.
And the real question is,
where we
have to save.
To call them Anglos
Where did they
is
go
a disgrace.
We have failed to deal with the maple problem. we will address
What's
that.
the answer to the leaf question?
Exactly. Episode 2. Stay tuned for Canada. The Vikings had been in what is today Canada. They never established a permanent settlement, but this was not lost to the ether. Sailors, especially in those days, are a tight-knit group. Even today, if you meet a sailor, they're kind of weird people. There's a reason for that. They're runaways from home. They're a little bit wayward. Who wants a life where you're at sea all the time and never home? So it selects for people that are kind of a bit eccentric, maybe esoteric. So they're going to keep a tight-knit community. These port cities around Europe, from Portugal to Norway, you have these taverns where these sailors visiting from various parts of Europe, they're getting together, they're sharing maps with each other, they're exchanging rumors, kind of trying to see who's got the inside knowledge, where the trade wins, who's got the routes, where they're less likely to be pirates, that kind of thing. And the big trade that was going on at the time was the Silk Road trade with Asia. The Ottoman Empire had blocked off most of the land route and was taxing the fuck out of Europeans, or honestly really just kidnapping and killing them if they tried to cross over land. So the Spanish and Portuguese were trying to find a way around it, and this would have basically as soon as the Ottomans were able to close off the Silk Road. So this was why I bring up the 14th century. Now, the Portuguese had something kind of interesting going on. You know, there's a reason why they're known as a seafaring people. One of the ideas that they had thought of was maybe we can sail around Africa. When you leave Portugal, and we don't have a map in front of me, and you start heading south and you go around West Africa, where it kind of juts out and then curves down, when you get around to modern day, like Senegal, maybe further south, more like Ivory Coast, where it kind of curves southwards.
Right, Nigeria.
There are some trade winds there. These are the same winds that bring hurricanes over from Africa to the Americas. And the Portuguese notice these trade winds pretty immediately. And if you can time it right, and you have a good wind with a strong sail and a captain who's got bigger balls than anyone here,
Yeah.
Let's just go there, yeah.
put his crew on the line, he's going to say, guys, let's give it a shot. I got a hunch about this. And lo and behold, that hunch was right. While yes, we'll credit Columbus for discovering America, he may have not been the first European in that time period. Portuguese find out about these trade winds. Ship technology in the 14th century, it was improving, but to do a transatlantic voyage still would have been fairly risky. So I can totally picture if you're a crew hand and your captain says, guys, let's go west, you all look at him, he's going to get us all killed.
Yeah, like, throw him overboard. Something happened. Oops.
What is this guy doing?
Right.
But, you know, a few of those guys that did it, it worked for them. And they had noted there's something out there. When they're following these trade winds off the coast of Africa, and like you're at sea, and then you start hearing birds chirping, and you're seeing certain climate formations, you know, there's something over there.
Right.
They may have not necessarily made landfall. They probably could have gotten in sighting of a landmass. These most likely would have been Brazil. They would have a strong hunch that something is there. Now, obviously, they have a mission to do. They're trying to get around Africa, so it would be hard to justify a detour.
A detour like that.
In the
When your mission is to get precious cargo because our economy needs it, and by the way, we're paying you a lot of money, and you decide, you know, I'm just going to go the other way. See what happens. You will probably be imprisoned.
The king will not be thrilled on that one.
No, but he makes a note in his journal. And then one day he's at port, whether it's in France or in England or in the Netherlands.
Right.
And he's getting drunk at the tavern. He's like telling his other sailors, guys, like, you're not going to believe this one. There's something out there. People get curious. People start sniffing around. Another thing at that time was fishermen from England and from the Basque country in Spain started depleting the stocks of cod off their shores. So they kept having to go further and further out. However, cod tends to live more or less fairly in continental shelves, kind of close to the coast.
There was some like near the Azores.
They wouldn't be out in open ocean.
Yeah.
But think about this. If you can get to the Azores, you're kind of like halfway there.
Right.
And you're following the swarms of fish, and you're following the trade winds. Well, it just so happens that there are massive cod breeding grounds off the coast of New England and maritime Canada. So this would be Nova Scotia, Maine, New Brunswick, that area. And it's called the Grand Banks. The ocean gets much shallower there. There's a lot of sand underneath it. Way back in the Ice Ages, the coastline used to extend out to here, so that's why it's much shallower.
Right.
You can find stuff there. But it's a very popular place for fish to breed, so there's a massive fish population there, mainly cod. And these Basque and Englishmen started bringing in these hauls, and they'd show up to port with a boat full of fish, and people would ask, well, this doesn't make sense. You depleted all the cod stocks around here, what's going on? And they're like, it's a sailor secret. If you tell anyone, I'll kill you. Sailors are they're being a secretive people. But the point is, throughout the 14th century and into the 15th century, within these tight-knit circles, rumors are spreading. People already knew about the Viking voyage. They're hearing of these fishermen. They're hearing that the Portuguese are making notes in their journals. They're drawing off on the side of the map, here be dragons. Yeah. That wasn't all necessarily a joke. These guys were speaking in code. They have their own sailor talk. They're signaling there's something there. What's going on? What gives it away? Leading up to Columbus's famous voyage in the years before, Portugal begins investing massively in a navy. And other countries are noticing it because you would see they're building all these ships, all this lumber's going on. They ask the Portuguese, what's it for? And they're like, it's for trade to go around Africa. And people are like, right.
Yeah. No, it's for our national security. We're passing a bill.
What's going on? So the Spaniards, being the rivals of the Portuguese, are like, these guys are up to something. This is where Columbus comes in. You had the demographic changes in England. You had rumors that there was something out there in the Atlantic Ocean out west. And when Columbus decided to cash in on this bet and see maybe there is something out there and maybe I can get in on it on my own, this opens up the frenzy. And this is where the story gets going. The Spaniards start setting up shop in America. The Americas, the continent. I hate that thing, Latin Americans. They're like, it's United States. America's a continent. Call yourself United States.
The new
you see that shit on Twitter.
It's the new world, right? It's the new world, right?
Fuck off,
it's
fuck
the
off, Pedro.
We found it first. Fuck you. Yeah.
Gringos talking. Exactly. The point is, the Spaniards get in on the Caribbean, and this kind of opens up a frenzy.
Right, you have Cortez in 1521, right? He's going to what's modern day Mexico.
They see he's hauling back gold, just by the boatload. People see this as making Spain very rich. Other countries start getting noticed.
And they're conquering, too, right? They're creating an empire. It's not like they're bringing civilization to savages, right?
From Mexico to the Southern Cone. Yes, they're getting in on it.
They're exploring, right? They're naturally wanting to, see what's out there, so...
Other countries take notice, and they kind of want to get in on it, but it's also, one, it's expensive, and two, there's other shit going on in Europe. At this time, the Protestant Reformation is kicking off, and we're not going to get into the theology of it so much, but we can talk about the demographic and social aspects that happened. I had mentioned before that England had already been kind of self-selecting itself and breeding to be a nation of independent, entrepreneurial people who don't have much of a respect for the authority of people in funny hats. So you can see the way they would take very naturally to the Protestant Reformation. But in addition to that, they are also going to have a bit of a reformist mindset, not just in terms of religion, but in terms of civil law, how the economy should be structured, how families should be structured, how people should relate to one another. It really sparks off a whole
and that's been in the
revolution.
Anglo sense, right? The Magna Carta,
Yes,
all that.
it has.
It's not a new thing at all.
And you see this in other countries that took to Protestantism as well, especially in the Netherlands. So when this Reformation kicks off, it obviously sparks a lot of controversy. And here begin the European Wars of Religion. When you factor in that there had already been an imperial rivalry between the House of Tudor in England and the Crown of Castile in Spain, they had already been feuding with each other, and then you throw religion into the mix, you now have a lot of bad blood. The thinking in England at the time is, we got to do something about the Spaniards. We can't let them one up us. Like, come on,
the Spanish menace.
We're English. We're gonna take shit from Pedro? No, we're not. So the English come up with ideas. They got an empire in America. We're going to get one too, and we're going to fuck their shit up. First thing that the English start trying to do is go into the Caribbean and start nipping some of the Spanish colonies and getting in on it themselves. They take places like the Bahamas. They take places like Barbados. They settled Bermuda. I think some of the Windward Islands, although that might have come later. But they settled down here. Realize these places are very pretty and there's nice beaches, but they're tropical climates where malaria runs deep. It's not really a great place for Englishmen to settle. But you can grow cash crops here. Enter in the slave trade. The Portuguese had started importing slaves into Brazil. People realized that maybe they're more suited for the tropical climates. There weren't really any Amerindians around anymore. They had been wiped out by smallpox to do the harvesting here. Now, when I say people got in on the slave trade, we should probably specify a little bit of what was going on.
Yeah, we could dive into it.
This might be a later episode. But let's just say
and all that. Yeah, but
the people who were settling in the Caribbean and setting up the slave trade there, they were from the Netherlands,
right?
And they were from Spain.
They were very Dutch.
Yes, but
to quickly get back on, I mean, you were hitting on a key point. I wanted to also just tie this into Britain when it was held by the Romans and they fled once the Germans came and essentially kicked them out, kicked their ass. Right. The idea of going out west and creating an empire versus going out west and seeing what's out there. Mm-hmm. Right. I think these two ideas are very different, and it's very interesting because in one sense you have the Anglo-Saxon thrive to we don't take shit from authority. We want to go and claim our own stake, just how our ancestors had done in Anglia and in Saxony and Lower Saxony. But then you have this what you had just said. You have the royalty saying, oh, we want to one up the Spanish. We want to create an empire. We want to go out west. And I think when the Spanish and the Portuguese were going out west, I don't know if I think the imperial mindset was definitely forefront of it. But when the English that went out west into the New World, I think there was a slightly different thought process, a different heritage.
This has been noted by historians back when our country had proper historians that did their research and knew where they came from. There's an old saying, it's kind of a truism. The Spaniards went to the Americas for the glory of the empire and for gold. The English went for God.
Continue that
thought. Anyways, the English, would have been before Britain, first try their hands at the Caribbean, realize it's not a place where a white man can live. And we can touch on the slave trade.
Which is why the Spaniards had such a...
Yeah, well, the Spaniards were doing a lot of stuff. We can touch in on the slave trade. They tried Irish people in the Caribbean. It didn't really work.
I'm sure that didn't go well.
For obvious reasons.
Did not go well. But then they realized, well, there's this whole eastern seaboard of North America that no one's really claiming. The Spaniards didn't really want it. The French had been poking around there a bit, but not much. Really just sending fur traders, that kind of thing. But the English realized, all right, we have an opportunity here. And actually the Dutch realized this too. We'll touch on it when we get to the founding of New York. So the English go about setting colonies. But how does this happen? You want people who want to be there.
Right.
You know, people who are like, okay, I am going to do this. I am going to take the risk. I have my motivations. I can't stay in England for whatever it is. I have to go west. And this is where we'll get into the founding of each colony, because, like I said, the English are sort of an independent-minded, entrepreneurial people, and their settling of the colonies is reflected in this, because it wasn't some grand imperial project written by the king saying, you know, all right, you go to Virginia, you go to Massachusetts, you go to South Carolina. It was more these independent power brokers who represented various factions in England, which at the time, very tumultuous, Protestant Reformation going on, wars of religion, English Civil War. There's a lot of different factions running around England and Scotland with their different motivations.
Foreign invasions, the Spanish, the Portuguese fleet, right before then.
Yeah, these people in England who represent different social classes. The Protestant Reformation started like kind of splintering a bit, so you had different religious sects. You had Presbyterians in Scotland. You had Puritans running around in England. You had your traditional Anglicans. You had some really one-off crazy sects such as Levelers, Quakers, Anabaptists, that kind of thing. But they all spawned from that same, you know, entrepreneurial, independent-minded people. And when they go out to do the colonies, they're going to carry that same attitude with them. Again, not a, you know, top-down approach centrally planned by the king in London, but these independent parties going out. Now, obviously, they had royal sanction for some of them, but you can kind of see that in each of the colonies, each of these colonial ventures, they selected for a specific type of person who had specific motivations for why they were going there. And when you compound that, once they get into America, over the course of a couple generations, you really start to see the divergence in how these people started to become into their own and become different from the people who remained behind in England. So let's go down the list. The first one, Virginia. Jamestown, you all know the story. John Smith, Pocahontas, all that fun stuff. Mm-hmm. But what was really going on
she
there?
created America.
Clearly.
That's why she's on the $1 bill.
As a side note, this is why I don't like to use the term Native American, because
we're Native Americans. We're free white men of good character.
Exactly.
Born on
this
American
has been touched
soil.
on by other people on the dissident right, but before the Englishmen showed up, there was no America.
Right.
These people were Cherokees, they were Iroquois, they were whoever the fuck.
Blackfoot, yeah, right.
But they were not Americans. To give you an idea of how Americans viewed these tribes, they were treated as foreign powers.
Right.
Like when they negotiated
with
like the Cherokee tribe or with the Choctaw, they were treated as if we were dealing with a foreign power, because they were not considered part of us. Anyways, we start having the settlement of the 13 colonies. Virginia was set up by a private company, the Virginia Company. This one did have royal sanction. It was a bit of a top-down approach. You had the king in London. This would have been
King James.
I believe James the First.
Yeah, 1603.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah. That's the first James before.
That would have been the first. Jamestown.
Yeah.
The Virginia Company. Mm-hmm. This was a private company that had shareholders, like you know any modern corporation, and it was somewhat privately funded expedition. Their charter explicitly laid out, we're going to run this colony as a business. So what that means is, as a shareholder, you are entitled to the profits of the colony. That could be from whatever resources that you find there. They didn't really know what would be out there. They thought maybe there's gold mines, maybe there's timber, or just whatever you can grow on the land. So that's selected for people who generally had the means to invest in this business. Who's going to go to Virginia and set up a capital-intensive operation and try to get a return on their investment? People who had money. So this was going to be a lot of people from the nobility. The second sons of nobles, by the concept of primogeniture. When a noble died, his firstborn son inherited his titles and his land. The second and third born sons didn't really get anything. Yeah. But, you know, they're still like smart, capable people, and they're educated, so they have to go out and make their way in the world. One way to do it was to join the army or the navy and, you know, become an officer. And the other way to do it was to go to Virginia.
Right.
These people are the ancestors of the plantation owners. They moved out there, and they basically replicated the manorial lifestyle that they had grown up in. You know, there's a lot of plantation houses with like feudal manners, and the way they set it up with their laborers was very similar to feudalism. And I don't mean, you know, when I say slavery, people have to think, oh, it's, you know, like we shipped black people over here, but that was not originally the case. It was the lower classes of England and Ireland. People would try to spin that,
and Scotland.
All over the British Isles.
Right.
People would try to spin that, you know, those, let's just call them servants or peasants.
Serfs, whatever.
It wasn't as bad as slavery, you know. They had some sort of labor contract, and like they could put.
No, it was hell on earth.
No, it absolutely was hell. The way these guys were recruited is you'd send a soldier to just like go into where the peasants lived, and basically just kidnap people. Be like, oh, you're poor. Well, you're behind on your debts. You can either pay your debt. Which you obviously can't because you're broke.
Poor, yeah.
You can go to prison, or you can go to Virginia and work on this guy's plantation.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the charges that they would use to get you to go over there may have been made up. So it was more, you don't have a choice.
Right.
You have to remember at the time in the British Isles, there's a lot of wars going on. You had the English Civil War, which is really about 3 different wars. Within each country, Scotland had their own civil war. There were massive wars in Ireland.
There was change of government. Right.
And basically, anytime a side lost, the losers of that side were told, get the fuck out of town, and you can go to Virginia. So they started sending them over there as a quote-unquote indentured servants, which, you know, they say, oh, they had a contract, you could become free. No, it was expected that you would die.
Right.
If you survived the journey, you would die in your labor.
It's a great way to get rid of your political enemies.
Yes, it is also a great way to get rid of your surplus population. I mentioned in the British Isles there had been a population explosion. With advances in technology, you had less need for agricultural laborers. People were flooding cities, so you had slums of poor people. That can be dangerous. It can cause a revolution. England was already going through civil wars. They wanted to nip this in the bud and get tired of it, and started sending these people off to Virginia. And this model ended up being replicated in Maryland, in Delaware, and in South Carolina as well. However, due to issues of cost, Christian morality, honestly part of it, and maybe a small-hatted influence, someone got the idea that instead of having the poor stock of England go, we'll still send them over, but let's also bring in people from Africa. The first slaves start showing up. They weren't enslaved though at the time. They were treated similarly to the I hate using the term indentured servants, but I'm going to use it. But they were treated similarly where theoretically they could become free and, you know, buy their freedom, sue in a court of law, and potentially own their own property. They were treated the way the English poor would have been treated. The problem is the African is nothing like an English peasant.
Right.
And they quickly realized we cannot apply the tenets of English jurisprudence and property rights and common law to an African. As dumb as an English or Irish peasant might be, he is not an African.
Yeah.
And so the colonial administrators realized that very quickly and thus codified racial-based slavery.
Right.
And said, nope, these people can't be trusted. If we don't keep an eye on them, they are going to start causing chaos. And you can read the stories of free blacks in colonial Virginia doing about what you would expect. They're robbing people. They're raping them. They're committing murders. They're causing loud noise and playing music till 3 a.m, and they're ruining the nice part of town, and they make it so it's unsafe to go out at night. What the fuck else is new? Yeah. So they decided, nope, you guys are going to be enslaved. But that's how some of the colonies were founded. Others had a bit more of an explicit agenda to them. You know, I said Virginia, and then later Maryland, Delaware, South Carolina had this plantation kind of motive involved. Virginia also did have a bit of a Catholic element to it. I mentioned every time a group in Britain lost a war, they had to get out of town. Well, one group that really lost the English Civil War were English Catholics and Irish Catholics. They did not fare well. There was an English noble named Baron Baltimore who wanted to create a haven for Catholics in the New World, and thus founded Maryland, Maryland.
Right.
It's a very Catholic name.
Right.
However, he also realized, well, Virginia's making money hand over fist with these tobacco plantations, I'm going to do the same. So they quickly adopted that model. Other colonies were a little bit different, though. The big one we'll get into next is
Plymouth Rock, right? I mean, I think we got it.
wider New England, Massachusetts, Plymouth Rock, the Puritans, the Pilgrims. This is really where a lot of the mythos of religious freedom comes from. The Puritans back in England, I'll try to gloss over what somewhat complex theology, but the name Puritan means you want to purify something. So these are members of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, who thought that the Reformation did not go far enough. They were of a more Calvinist influence, and they wanted the Church of England to adopt a more Presbyterian type of structure. What does that mean in short terms? It means bishops don't have power and local congregations can make their own decisions. Well, the Church of England, given that it is controlled by the king, who personally appoints the bishops, when you have people saying that the bishops should not have power, he's obviously going to be pretty pissed at them.
Yep.
So after the Puritans lost the English Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell's regime fell, they were a target, and they had to get out of town. And they started going to Massachusetts. You had a subset of Puritans called Pilgrims, who did not believe in purifying the Church of England. They believed in separating from it entirely. They thought, this is too corrupt, we'll never be able to turn it around, let's go off and do our own thing. And they were also feeling the heavy hand of the state, because government can't just have an independent religious sect of fairly motivated and high IQ, like wealthy commoners and merchants going around saying, we don't obey your authority.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that's a problem. They just went through a civil war. You're not going to have that. So the Pilgrims got ran out of town. First, they went to the Netherlands, because the Netherlands had a similar religious denomination, also Calvinist. But, and actually, this is kind of funny. After one generation in the Netherlands, they were worried their kids were becoming Dutch. And thought, no, we're Englishmen, we're not Dutch. Stop speaking that shitty language.
I don't know. I think if anything, it shows you that we're all a little bit more related than we.
No, it's
kind of funny.
It's one of those funny stories. So they wanted to leave the Netherlands, and they couldn't go back to England. But they're like, hey, look, we're still Englishmen. We may not disagree. Let's cut a deal. You let us go to America. We'll pay you taxes. You can get money, but just generally leave us alone.
Right.
They're like, fine. So they do that. This is the story of the Mayflower, where they head over to the New World, settle Plymouth Rock. While they were on the Mayflower, right before they got off the boat and walked up the shore, they wrote down a series of laws for what they're going to do when they get on shore. What type of society are they going to set up? This is called the Mayflower Compact. It's important in American civics class. Again, I'm not going to get too much into ideals and form of government, but you'll see this kind of echoes the theme of where they come from as a people. In the Mayflower Compact, it was, we're going to have a meritocracy. We are here to live godly and chaste lives. We are not going to confer titles of nobility onto people. Everyone is going to do their part. You are going to work. We're going to have farmers. We're going to have craftsmen. We are going to teach people to read so they can read the Bible. We are going to make our little utopia according to our ideals. But when these guys get to America and they draft their ideal society, it was very much with the mentality, we have our yearning to go west. This is a place where we can recreate our perfect society ordained by God.
Indeed.
Getting a little high and mighty here.
Yeah.
But ordained by God
Sure.
to build the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Okay.
And when you have people who are highly motivated, they believe in this. This isn't like Virginia where these guys were just going to make money and run plantations. These people believe they were called by God to do this. And they had the resources and the motivation and the know-how to do it when they got there. That's going to select for a certain kind of person that probably could be prone to bouts of insanity,
right.
but also gets shit done, and doesn't take crap from people.
Yeah.
So they settled at Plymouth Rock. You know the story. Maybe some of that isn't necessarily true with the first Thanksgiving. I don't buy it that the Indians welcomed them and they betrayed them. No, it was conflict from the get-go. The Pilgrims immediately recognized these people are savage heathens who want to kill us, and this is a kill or be killed. But we have God and muskets on our side, so get fucked, Squanto. So they went about setting up Plymouth Rock, and then a little bit later, the Puritans set up Massachusetts. Puritan and Pilgrim. At the time, that distinction mattered. These days, not as much.
What were the core differences between?
Puritans believed they could reform the system.
Okay.
Pilgrims wanted to separate from it.
Gotcha.
But theologically, they pretty much believe more or less the same thing.
Right.
But in both colonies, in Massachusetts and Plymouth Rock, it selects for that certain type of highly motivated, deeply pious, hardworking, learned, educated, practical person. And when you have them all bunched up in a colony, and everyone's got a strong personality, they're going to be butting heads a lot.
Of course.
So when they butt heads, you kind of get run out of town if you lost to the debate. This is a common theme here.
Yeah.
The guy who loses the argument gets run out of town.
Maybe the real manifest destiny was just running people out of town towards
Now in Plymouth Rock, if you lost an argument, in some cases they did burn you at the stake, but generally they told you to leave. So then you had guys that are like, all right, I'm going to keep going to another colony. That'll be the new kingdom of God.
Yeah.
This is how Rhode Island gets started.
Right.
This is how Connecticut gets started. People that were annoyed at the Puritans a bit much and said, I'm going to do Puritanism even better. And you see, from Massachusetts to
No wonder
Rhode
they all
Island
hate each other. It's
to Connecticut.
Yep.
You see what direction they're heading in?
South.
Yeah.
Well,
What?
No, I know.
They're heading west.
I know they're heading west.
They're heading west. They keep heading west, and they want to keep going west, but they run into a roadblock. There's a place called New Netherland.
Ah, shit.
The Dutch are there.
Right.
And at first, the
It was
Dutch...
New Amsterdam, right?
That was the city, but the wider colony was called New Netherland. The Dutch controlled way into upstate New York as well.
Interesting. Got it.
And they controlled Long Island. And at first they were like, well, the Pilgrims, they stayed in the Netherlands, and, they're the same religion as us, and, common Germanic people. Let's let them in. And then after a while, they started to outnumber the Dutch. And the Dutch were getting pretty annoyed. They kept insisting on speaking English. And, not speaking Dutch, lesson in immigration here.
Right.
They started, in different towns, they started voting themselves into political power.
I'm really hearing some common themes here, yeah.
The Dutch were getting pretty annoyed by that. And then what ended up happening is simultaneously back in Europe, England fought a war with the Netherlands over colonies in the Caribbean, and it ended in a draw. And part of the treaty, the Dutch, they're a very mercantile people. They're going to go for the money.
Of course.
So they took the Caribbean island. I believe this would have been Aruba.
Curacao, right?
Curacao, yeah.
This would have been Curacao. And in exchange, they gave us New York.
The worst trade deal in the history of trade.
Which is
at least if you're Dutch.
Funny because the Dutch got New York or New Netherland through their own trade deal. You know the story when they bought Manhattan Island
12 beads
with
or
the
something.
Lenape Indians. They gave them a gift bag, like a literal gift basket of trinkets, and said, "Here you go. This is our island now."
Yeah, get the hell
And
out.
some autistic historians if you adjust it for inflation and the cost of goods sold on that, yeah, it's $30.
It's a great trade.
You know what it probably was? Just leftover stuff they had on the ship.
All right, guys, we got some shitty pot steam or something. Yeah, let's
Some pots and
yeah,
pans.
oh fuck! What's something that these people have no knowledge of, fire? I guess I don't know. Well, I don't know. If you look at the exited Moik and IRR on their trade of buying New Amsterdam, New Netherland for a bag of beads or whatever, and selling it to the English for Curacao.
You mentioned MOIC
Yeah.
and IRR.
Right.
This is perfect for where I'm going with New York. When the Puritans were in the other colonies, they wanted to recreate, the kingdom of heaven.
Of course.
These were theocratic societies. Totally. Massachusetts was a theocracy into the 1820s.
Yeah.
But when they got to New York, they couldn't quite do that. On one hand, there were a lot of Dutch people living there who, even if they like more or less agreed with them on religion, they couldn't, they have a Dutch way of doing
It's a different mentality.
They have a Dutch way of doing things. So you couldn't like quite impose your theocracy. You kind of got to play ball with them. So when the English took over, they work out a deal with the Dutch. Hey, we're just going to have a secular government, so you guys can practice your religion. You can speak Dutch. We'll practice ours. And we'll go about our business. And business is what they went about.
Indeed.
I mentioned these are mercantile, entrepreneurial, hardworking people. The Dutch are similar. You have them living side by side. They've worked out a laissez-faire approach to government. New York is a very excellent trade location. You see where this is going.
Was it
New
primarily
York.
was New York primarily like hinterland / American continent trade, or was it more like we need to send all the stuff from the colonies like in the Caribbean to New York to repackage to send off?
Column A, column B.
Okay.
Upstate New York, when the Dutch ruled it, it was very much like frontier fur trading towns.
Yeah.
But New Amsterdam, later New York, was also a waypoint for goods coming up from the Caribbean.
Gotcha.
But to see where I'm going with this, you have these very hardworking mercantile Puritans, the famously mercantile Dutch, already, by matter of practicality, set up a laissez-faire government
Yep.
at one of the best harbors and trading ports in the world.
Yeah.
You see where like the origins of New York, being the financial colony, start coming into play. Wall Street
Mm-hmm.
was
The old Dutch wall.
Wallstraat in Dutch, I believe.
Yeah.
That they used to have a wall there to keep the
We're gonna
engines
build a
out.
wall and keep the engines
We're
out.
gonna-
And then they paid
Based
for it.
Peter Stuyvesant, by
He was
the
cool.
way. He was the last. Quick tangent here. He was the last Dutch governor of New Netherland before the English took over. And he as part of like the laissez-faire attitude, they had a bunch of like random immigrants coming in
Right.
to New Amsterdam, and
I'm sure he wasn't a fan.
got pissed, and he was mainly pissed at one particular group.
Right,
That
yeah,
was the
slave
movie.
traders.
He's like, guys, stop bringing a bunch of Negroes here, and stop
I bet he got it.
stop taking Friday and Saturday off. I'm getting tired of your shit. So he actually tried to kick him out too.
He did, yeah.
He got into a little bit of trouble though with some of the other colonial officials because the Dutch colonial officials in the Caribbean,
Yeah, they needed their business.
being told by
relationships.
Peter Stuyvesant that they weren't welcome
Right.
there pissed him off. So they used their connections in the Netherlands and got him fired. What could have been.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
But anyways, when you have the English come in, New York becomes a very laissez-faire mercantile society. Two more to get into. Next one, we'll just jump into Pennsylvania. Famously, the quote-unquote Quaker colony. William Penn Sr., he was I guess not really a noble, but he was a very wealthy commoner. The Quakers believed a lot of weird things, but again, the highly motivated entrepreneurial people. This guy was like an early industrialist, and he had made a lot of money, but he was on the losing side of the Civil War. He didn't want to get killed, so he used his wealth to kind of buy his way into the good graces of the government and work out a deal with them. And then his son, William Penn Jr., basically picked up where he left off and said, all right, we're going to set up another colony. We don't want these Dutch poking around here. We don't want the Spanish poking around. We're kind of shoring up. We're getting New England. We're getting the South. Let's close the gap here. Offers to set up Pennsylvania, William Penn.
Right. Yeah.
Clearly. He is a Quaker, and he's a very pious Quaker and strongly believes in his religion, but he doesn't quite set up Pennsylvania as an explicitly Quaker society in the way Massachusetts was a Puritan theocracy, where in Massachusetts, if you weren't a Puritan, you weren't even a citizen.
Right.
Not cool with that. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, because once the colonies are settled and you start seeing
Intercolonial
where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
But Pennsylvania gets set up, and William Penn's like, well, as a Quaker, I've been on the losing side of a civil war. I know what it's like to be persecuted for my religion. Yeah, he's a bit of a libtard, but, whatever. I'm going to set up Pennsylvania as a colony for all religions, which in those days meant Christians, by the way.
Of course.
Jews and pagans need not apply. Pagans meaning the Minjins over there. So he sets up Pennsylvania. A lot of Quakers go over there, and you can see a lot of Quakers, early Quakers were Welsh, so a lot of the Philadelphia suburbs
really
have Welsh place names.
Berwyn, Bryn Mawr,
exactly. So he sets up Pennsylvania and opens it up for a land of religious freedom. Well, I mentioned losing sides of civil wars from England. Well, this applies to more than just England. Concurrently, when this happened, there's the 30 Years' War in Europe.
Right.
And it's mainly in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the first Protestant Reformation. It's really, when people say that, you should really divide it into sections. Not to put on my, my preacher cap here.
Do it.
But the first wave of the Reformation is the Lutherans, who everyone knows about. And then later the Anglicans.
Is that Martin Luther King?
Yeah, Martin Luther King started the Protestant Reformation. I'm sure there's people who believe that. So you have the Lutherans and the Anglicans. And yeah, they're Protestant, but if you look at theologically, if you go to a Lutheran or Anglican service, it's really not that different from what the Roman Catholic Church would do. So for some reformers, they thought, that's not good enough. All you did was just replace the Pope with a king, but you didn't reform. So in the chaos of the war, you have a lot of groups popping up and running around, and one of these groups is called the Anabaptists. I guess we are getting a little bit into theology here.
That's important, right?
The most important thing that Anabaptists believe is adult baptism. They believe you can, to be baptized, you have to be a fully informed adult, so you can you know what you're getting into. You're consenting into the religion. They're true believers. They also had other beliefs about just how your lifestyle should be organized. They were very much into rejecting authority. I mean, they'd gone through the 30 Years' War, so they were suspicious of cops. They were suspicious of knights, of nobles, of bishops and priests, basically anyone who would tell you what to do. They were not cool with that. And in turn, nobody in the Holy Roman Empire was cool. Both Lutherans and Catholics at the Peace of Augsburg, which ended the 30 Years' War. Sorry, the Peace of Westphalia. Yes. Yeah. Both Catholics and Lutherans signed an agreement that said we're going to have religious tolerance. If you're Catholic, you're Catholic. If you're Lutheran, you're Lutheran. But they both signed an agreement that if you're Anabaptist, get fucked. Yeah. So the Anabaptists were on...
They got fucked, yeah.
We're on the short end of the stick. And when they hear William Penn is setting up Pennsylvania...
Let's go.
And going, hey, you guys can come here and, similar to the other English Protestants, they might have some kooky beliefs, but they're hard-working farmers. They're going to head out there, and this is where Pennsylvania gets its kind of distinctly German character from. Mm-hmm. And some of these people are the ancestors of the Amish. So you get them settled into Pennsylvania. I'll give a quick rundown of the demographic overview here. Massachusetts, well, not Massachusetts, but New England broadly, it's very homogenous. After the first great wave of Puritan migration, New England did not get a lot of immigration to it. The population was all natural births, and Puritans were very fertile people. They were having 8, 9 kids a family. Their population was doubling every 20 years, but it was very homogenous. Everyone was English. Everyone was a Puritan.
Right.
New York, it's the laissez-faire commercial society. It's a mix of English and Dutch and Scots and French and Germans. Yeah. You kind of see the quote-unquote the melting pot.
Yeah.
Sorry. Pennsylvania is about, depending on where you are, it's English, it's Welsh, it's German. In the backcountry, you have the Scots-Irish. We'll touch on them in a second. They play a huge role in this. As you move further south, where you have the plantation colonies, you have the upper classes of the planters. They're mainly English from the nobility. And then the lower classes, they're English, they're Irish, they're Scottish. People that got the short end of the stick and ended up there. And a lot of them are black, too. And then I guess the last thing to touch on would be the people that wanted to go to America but didn't really want to be part of any colony. They wanted to settle the frontier areas outside of colonial control. These are the Appalachian Mountains, the people that were like, I'm going even further west.
The crazy Highlanders, basically.
No, they weren't Highlanders, but these are the ancestors of the hillbillies.
Gotcha.
You have these people from northern England, southern Scotland, that border region, very chaotic at the time. There's wars going on. They didn't do well in the war either. So the first place they were sent was Ireland.
Right.
They're like, well, you can put the mix down at least.
Sure.
And they go over to Ireland, but Ireland is a pretty wild place. The Irish are still kind of semi-savage at these times. They're fucking murdering these
they're
guys.
the descendants of the border retrievers. That's their ancestors.
The first place they sent these border retrievers was to Ireland to try to pacify the Irish. But it wasn't going that well because Ireland was a wild place and there's wars in Ireland too. And also, these are like kind of clannish, parochial people who don't like the city slickers. So even if they're Protestant and they're not Irish, they're also not really gonna be big fans of the king in London.
Yeah, and it's hard to control an area if you don't have an urban outpost to kind of exert control.
Yeah, they want to be doing their own thing. A lot of them, they're not farmers, they're ranchers. It means they're itinerant. Ranchers move around a lot. You're not settled in one place. So they're just kind of, roaming around. Ireland starts getting a little too hot and heavy for them, so then a lot of them are like, fuck it, we're going to America, but we're not going to repeat the same mistakes and just, be a slave to some dipshit in Virginia. We're going to go outside the realm of control, and we're going even further west, where we can have our own land, practice our own culture, live in peace. And they start settling the frontier region. So the backwoods of Pennsylvania, these people, the Scots-Irish, they have a lot of different terms, borderers, Scots-Irish, Ulstermen, just Protestant people from the backwoods parts of England, Ireland, and Scotland. That's essentially what they are. They start settling the backcountry. These are the ancestors of the Appalachians, of people from West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, that kind of thing. And when they're in America, again, they want their independence. Whether it's the king in London or the colonial official in Jamestown or a banker in New York or a Puritan in Boston, they want nothing to do with you. They want to be left alone. They want to live in the mountains. They want to do their own thing. They want to make their moonshine, do whatever it is. So that's, it's not broad strokes. It's very in-depth. You have the colony set up. Who are the people that are living there? Mostly, they were about 60% English, and then the rest, it was Germans, Dutch, Irish, and some French. French, some were like French from Canada, some were...
The French were further inland, right?
Yeah, but you also just had French Huguenots.
Oh, yeah, around here.
They were
around
losing side of a war. You had to get out of town.
And later on, they were doing commerce with, which is modern day fucking Canada, but Canada, their actual lore is, not as interesting as the 13 colonies, but they also were beaver traders, right?
Yes,
they were guys that were outcasts.
Even in the actual English colonies, you just had French people that were like, all right, I can have a better life here.
Of course. Yeah.
I'll go do it. So you have a country. It's mostly Protestant. It's mostly British, plurality English, but majority overall just Northern European. Germanic, whether it's English or Scottish or Dutch or German.
What were the Danes up to at this point? And what is there any kind of Swedish?
The Swedes had tried to colonize what is today New Jersey. Wilmington, Delaware used to be Fort Christiana. I think she was a queen of Sweden at the time. But it didn't last long. The Dutch took over, and then the English subsequently just went over the top on them. Also, in those days, Scandinavia was involved. They had other concerns.
Didn't they have their whole they were fighting? They had another war going on.
They were fighting wars with Russia and stuff. Right. And America was not a priority for them.
Of course.
The Holy Roman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
I forgot about later on.
I covered that briefly. Supposed to be the Catholic refuge, but they also realized, we can make money growing tobacco. So they set up something kind of similar to Virginia, but a lot of the upper classes of Maryland were Catholic. Typically in England, when it turned Protestant, there were some holdouts of Catholics that tended to be a certain kind of noble, like a type of guy who really believed in absolute monarchy, steeped in divine right of kings, steeped in tradition, smells and bells, all that.
They're very historical.
But
to
there
the
weren't
Crusades and all
What
that.
was their ethnic background? Were they
These were English.
Well, I know they're English, but like you have the basic races of England, right? Like you have the Normans, you have the.
These guys would have been. I mean,
they were just Anglos. They were Anglo-Saxons. They just didn't convert to Protestantism.
These guys would have been. I mean,
were there ethnic patterns to?
Somewhat. Actually, yeah.
I disagree with that completely.
Well, are you referring specifically to Maryland or like the colonies? Because there is with other colonies.
I kind of mean just like the Catholic nobility, right? The people in England, the precursors to Maryland, right? The ones that were.
So the group of people you're talking about were not that numerous to begin with, and I'll touch on this a little down the road. Very quickly in Maryland, Catholics got outnumbered by Protestants. There just weren't that many of them, and even though they were Catholic, they were still English, so they weren't like necessarily down with the Irish.
Right.
As far as there being like an ethnic or regional component to them, some were from the Scottish Highlands, but I think most were, English nobles.
Surprised that like more Scottish people didn't kind of say, "Oh, they're also Catholic. Like, let's roll." I guess
the Scots weren't really too good. It was
majority of Scotland was not only Protestant but very Presbyterian, which is a distinct form of Protestantism. But you did have some Catholic holdouts in like the really backwoods parts of the Highlands, like they call it the Highlands and Islands, very northern Scotland. Anyways, so you see like now that the colonies are set up, we have the demographic foundation of Americans. You say America, it's an English country, but maybe it's just a broader Northern European Germanic Protestant. You had English, you had Scots, you had Dutch, Germans, French Huguenots, Irish Protestants. And this was kind of recognized at the time, like, all right, these are our people. We'll assimilate everyone into speaking English, so the Dutch ended up losing their language, so did the Germans. But you're going to have your regional flavors.
I do think, though, calling it a country, not that we're not, but I'm not necessarily sure everyone viewed it that way.
At the time that I'm talking about right now, they did not.
Yes. Just wanted to clarify that.
That'll come later. At the time, they did not. In fact,
they were the same heritage, the same Anglo-Saxon bloodline, right? I mean, you have some Celtic, but
they're also very independently minded people.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to hone in on, right? Because the crown, when they were sponsoring these colonies, we're talking about the English king, right? Or eventually become Great Britain, I think in 1707, but. I'm not sure that we'll get into this shortly, but I think it's really interesting because like this history of the people and their mindset and why they came, their background, right, and everything that happened historically versus how the crown viewed all these colonies. Like I'm not sure they obviously eventually wouldn't see eye to eye, but I think it goes all the way to the beginning. It's not like we have the Boston Tea Party. Fast forward 200 years, that's kind of the root of this. You have people of a common ancestry.
This has been in the making for a
common
long time.
Ancestry, a common blood, the foundation of such a great people's work. Right?
All these groups I'm mentioning at the time, from like the Second Sons of Nobility in Virginia, the Puritans of Massachusetts, Scots-Irish in Appalachia. At the time, like those differences would have been noticeable and distinct, and
totally.
That's why people didn't really quite think of themselves as a country yet. And like they have hard boundaries. Puritans would say like, "Oh, don't visit New York. They're a bunch of atheists. Money loving who's.
Yep.
Or don't go to Pennsylvania. Quakers are weird."
Yeah.
And like they took those like differences seriously, but it's funny because like today, it just wouldn't even matter.
Right.
Like today, if you were to go out and be like, "I'm fighting for the Puritan nation of Massachusetts,"
people would think you're a LARPing autist.
Yeah, you have some guy in 7-Eleven. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to explain to a guy fresh off the boat from Pakistan that you have the fucking Puritan blood running through you to build the kingdom of God here.
He wouldn't get it.
It's just like, what? No, like you're just a weird white guy. Like, what are you talking about? It's on one hand, it's like kind of sad that like you had these kind of unique regional groups and different factions and the influence that they had, but at the same time, it's like, all right, yeah, you kind of are a retard if you're still trying to refight that fight. It's like, no, when this country is being invaded by the detritus of the third world, and you're trying to argue that New York is the rightful territory of, the Dutch Reformed Church. And it's just like, you're out to lunch, dude.
Well, I would also frame it this way, right? Do you believe that the aggregate whole is greater than the sum of its parts?
Well, I think at the time, that when you have the aggregate whole of the English Puritans and the German Anabaptists and the Scots-Irish and the Virginia planters, that aggregate whole, the sum of the parts of those specific parts, I think is pretty fucking great.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes the best country
totally
to have ever existed.
Absolutely.
It makes a country of people that don't take shit and that will go out and move west and conquer. And do you know why they do it? Because it is their manifest destiny to do
God
it.
told them.
Hey-o! All right, well, that's a pretty funny way to end it. I think we can chop it right there. I would like to flag to the listener that we have about 2 more hours of additional content on this topic that we recorded and we will keep discussing. However, for the sake of practicality, we want to sort of chop it right here. This is the first episode after all. We're about an hour and 15 minutes in, and we don't think necessarily dumping a 3-hour rant on the listeners is the best way to go about it. And there's still some refinement that we want to do in the later portion of this discussion. Kind of give a teaser and sort of give a summation. We're up about to the 18th century right now when the colonies are pretty fully settled, and the next thing that we're going to get into is how the colonies started to diverge from Britain and what caused the people who lived there to see themselves as more than just a Puritan in New England or a Scots-Irish in Appalachia or a Virginia planter, and what caused them to see themselves as Americans. There are a lot of factors that would contribute to that we're going to touch on, and this is really going to be what shapes the ethnogenesis of our people and what that means for us today. It's going to involve a lot of discussions of race relations. Dealings with the Indians and with the slaves play a massive role, as well as the political and economic relations the colonists develop with the British government. And you can kind of see how these independent religious groups might react to certain changes that were going on back home. But for the time being, we will chop it here. And in the subsequent maybe 1 to 2 more episodes, we'll see how we divvy up the rest of it. We'll be releasing that over the next probably couple of weeks. Listen, we're doing this for fun. We're not trying to make money on it. These are just topics that we're very passionate about, and when we discuss it, we hope people can maybe learn a thing or two. We all have our day jobs. We're all trying to make our way in the world. So the cadence may not necessarily be super regular, but we'll do the best we can. I think once we kind of get all the initial infrastructure set up, we'll be able to start churning these out on a fairly regular basis. Let's call that about once a month, once every couple of weeks. It'll kind of depend on each topic and what direction we want to go with this. But for the first few episodes, it is definitely going to be centered on the origins of Americans and the ethnogenesis of said people. However, going beyond that, we intend to take this in a lot of unique directions. I think there's a lot of topics on American history that are underexplored, or certain narratives that maybe are false or told in a way that doesn't jive with the historical record. So stay tuned for that. You can check out our Twitter and our Substack. The links will be in whatever source you clicked on to listen to this. So it could be, you're probably listening on our YouTube channel, or maybe the MP3 file on our Substack, so you're already aware of those, but we'll make sure that you have access to all that information. Keep you appraised of any updates, any other things that we're working on. If there's any questions that you guys have, you want to get in contact with us, we will definitely welcome any feedback and questions as well. I would like to say that we're all pretty informed on these topics, but we really did these with no notes. This is very much a freehand discussion, and we figured it was best to do it that way because it's going to spur a more natural conversation as opposed to reading a script and not necessarily checking every single thing. In one of my re-listens of this, I did notice that I made a few minor errors with dates and some names. It doesn't detract from the overall narrative, but I'll try to go back and catch those in editing or just in future episodes, put a disclaimer if it's egregious. And if you have a comment or a shout out on that where you say, oh, what you explained here was wrong, or maybe you should have touched more on this, we would be happy to take a look at those and address them. Listener feedback is always appreciated. In addition, before we wrap up here, I do want to give a shout out to some parties and some people that kind of gave us the inspiration for this and helped make this happen. Give a thank you to my co-hosts, Frank and Arthur. Appreciate their input. I know I kind of held court on this discussion, but going forward, we're going to have a more diverse range of speakers, just not only from my co-hosts, but we're thinking about expanding to having guest speakers on and maybe us showing up on other shows as well. Earlier in this recording, I also mentioned the Survive the Jive YouTube channel. That is one that I highly recommend. The gentleman who runs it is extremely knowledgeable on European history, especially Anglo-Saxon history. So if you want more information on the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England, I would suggest checking that out. I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the description of this video. In addition, I would also like to give a shout out to Adam, Hank, Hans, and Nick over at the Myth of the 20th Century. Before I started recording this, I was actually able to appear on their show as a guest speaker, talking pretty much about my day job, which you can maybe surmise what that is. But I think their show is very well done. It's very informative. And definitely when I was thinking about putting this together, I wanted examples of people who have done podcasts and have done it right and have a very well-made finished product. And theirs is definitely one that's worth checking out. So would certainly give them a look as well. With that, stay tuned for upcoming content, and we will see you on the far side.